The air in the mahogany-panelled room was thick enough to choke on smelling of old money leather and grief. At the head of the polished table sat Helen Graham, a widow of 3 weeks, her face a mask of serene composure. Across from her, shifting in her chair, was Brenda Jensen, the much younger woman who had been her husband's shadow for the last 5 years. The children sat between them, a buffer of tense silence. Everyone was waiting for the final act of Arthur Graham's life to play out. But no one, especially not the crying Mistress, could have anticipated the one sentence he left behind, a sentence that would turn her tears of grief into a scream of pure horror. The offices of Abernathy, Cole and Finch were a monument to old-world discretion. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that hadn't been opened in a generation, and the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of wealth being managed and protected. It was into this solemn chamber that the remnants of Arthur Graham's life were gathered. Helen Graham sat with a posture so perfect it seemed carved from marble. At 58 she was still a handsome woman, though life with Arthur had etched fine lines of fatigue around her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite conceal. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her only jewelry, the thin gold wedding band she had worn for 35 years, and a single strand of pearls. She hadn't shed a tear at the funeral, a fact that the society pages had noted with thinly veiled disapproval. They called her cold and ice queen. They didn't know the truth. She was not cold. She was a patient. To her right sat her son, David. At 32, he was a younger, harder version of his father with the same sharp blue eyes, but none of the deceptive charm. He ran the international division of Graham Enterprises and had seen his father's complexities up close. His hand rested near his mother's on the table, a silent gesture of support. To her left was Jessica, 28. She was the artist, the sensitive soul who had always been her daddy's girl. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a damp tissue in her hand. She shot occasional confused glances between her mother's stoicism and the dramatic display of grief coming from the other side of the table. And then there was Brenda Jensen. At 29, she was all vibrant, youthful sorrow. She wore a black dress that was just a little too tight. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup expertly applied to highlight her tear-filled sapphire blue eyes. She dabbed at them with a lace handkerchief, making sure everyone saw the effort. She had been Arthur's special assistant, a title that fooled no one. For 5 years she had been the sun Arthur orbited in public, while Helen remained the quiet, reliable moon at home. Brenda radiated an aura of entitlement, as if she were the true widow here, forced to endure this unpleasantness with the official family. She believed Arthur had loved her. She believed his final act would be to secure her future, to finally give her the status she deserved. Mr. Abernathy, a man who looked as dry and brittle as the ancient documents he handled, cleared his throat. He was Arthur's lawyer and friend for 40 years, and had seen the man through mergers, acquisitions, and 2 major tax audits. But this he sensed was Arthur's most audacious move yet. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice a dusty rustle. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Arthur William Graham, dated." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Just 6 weeks ago." A small, sharp intake of breath came from Brenda. 6 weeks ago. That was after Arthur's final diagnosis, when he knew the end was near. A wave of triumphant relief washed over her. He had updated it for her, to make sure she was taken care of. She shot a look at Helen, a mix of pity and victory. The poor, deluded old wife. Helen didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the lawyer, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had known about this updated will. In fact, she had been there the day Arthur called Mr. Abernathy to his study to draft it. She had served them both coffee, and then retreated a silent, ghost-like figure in her own home. Arthur had looked at her, with a strange, almost challenging glint in his eye. He thought he was playing one last game, one final, masterful manipulation. He had no idea that for the first time in their marriage, Helen was the one who held all the cards. The document is quite straightforward. Mr. Abernathy continued the rustling of the thick paper, filling the silence. Arthur has made provisions for several charitable foundations, which I will not detail here. Let us proceed to the personal bequests. He started with the children. David was to assume full control as CEO of Graham Enterprises, inheriting his father's majority shares. Jessica received a substantial trust fund and ownership of the family's summer home in the Hamptons. Both were generous expected provisions. Jessica managed a watery smile. David merely nodded, his expression unreadable. Brenda shifted impatiently. This was the opening act to the formalities. The main event, her part, was coming. She imagined what it would be: the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue he'd kept for them, a portfolio of stocks, a lump sum that would ensure she never had to work again. It would be his final grand declaration of love. Mr. Abernathy turned a page. And now for my wife, Helen Graham. Every eye in the room fell upon Helen. She remained perfectly still, her serene expression unwavering. Brenda leaned forward slightly, a smirk playing on her lips. She couldn't wait to hear what the dutiful discarded wife would receive. The cold comfort prize, the mansion she already lived in, a stipend to maintain her quiet, boring life. It was almost pathetic. To my wife, Helen Graham. The lawyer read, his voice steady. I bequeath our primary residence in Greenwich, Connecticut, and all its contents. I also leave her my entire personal art collection, my portfolio of municipal bonds, and a controlling interest in the G Holding Corporation, which, as you know, is the parent company of Graham Enterprises. A stunned silence fell. David's eyebrows shot up. Jessica gasped. The G Holding Corporation. That wasn't just a controlling interest. That was the interest. It meant that even though David was CEO, Helen was now his boss. She owned the company. She owned everything. Brenda's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion, and then anger. That was more than she expected. Far more. It was a king's ransom. Why would he give so much to the woman he had abandoned emotionally years ago? A cold knot of unease began to form in her stomach. But then she remembered his promises, the whispered assurances in the dead of night. I have to keep her comfortable, honey. It's for appearances. But you are my future. Her confidence returned, albeit slightly shaken. Her bequest would be different. It would be cash, liquid, freedom. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat again, looking down at the final page. And finally, he said, his eyes briefly flicking up to meet Brenda's over the rim of his glasses. The look held a trace of something she couldn't decipher. Pity, perhaps. Let's get on with it. Brenda said, her voice sharper than she intended. The lawyer's gaze returned to the document. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if preparing to detonate a bomb. To Ms. Brenda Jensen. He read, his voice devoid of emotion. Brenda sat up straighter, her grief-stricken facade momentarily forgotten, replaced by greedy anticipation. This was it. Her moment of validation. Helen, for the first time, turned her head slightly and looked directly at Brenda. Her eyes were not cold, not angry, not even triumphant. They were just watchful. It was the calm, observant gaze of a scientist studying a specimen under a microscope, waiting for the inevitable reaction. Mr. Abernathy read the single devastating sentence that Arthur Graham had crafted as his final, cruel masterpiece. To understand the explosion in that lawyer's office, one had to understand the architect who lit the fuse, Arthur Graham. On the surface, Arthur was the American dream personified. He had inherited a modest manufacturing business from his father, and through ruthless ambition and uncanny market intuition, had forged it into Graham Enterprises, a global conglomerate. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a smile that could disarm regulators and charm an entire boardroom. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a philanthropist, a family man. But behind the closed doors of their Greenwich estate, Helen knew the real Arthur. He was a man obsessed with control. Everything in their life was curated to reflect his success. Their home wasn't a home. It was a showroom. Their vacations weren't for relaxation. They were for networking. Even their children were in some ways assets. David, the heir apparent, was molded and pressured from childhood. Jessica, the beautiful artist, was the jewel he showed off at galas. Helen had been his first and greatest acquisition. She was the daughter of old money, possessing a grace and a pedigree that he, the son of a factory owner, craved. Their marriage was a merger. She gave him class, and he gave her a life of unimaginable luxury. In the early years, she had mistaken his possessiveness for passion, his control for care. He'd chosen her clothes, her friends, even her hobbies. "We're a team, Helen," he would say, "and I'm the quarterback." She played her part beautifully. She was the perfect corporate wife, hosting flawless dinner parties, remembering the names of 100 business partners and their spouses, and always standing silently smilingly by his side. She was his silent partner in the construction of their gilded cage. The cracks began to show slowly. It started with small lies, unexplained late-nights business trips that didn't quite add up. Then came the chill in their bedroom, a distance that had nothing to do with the physical space between them. Arthur wasn't cruel in a loud, aggressive way. His cruelty was quieter, a form of psychological erosion. He would praise her in public and then subtly undermine her in private. "That was a lovely dinner, darling," he might say in front of guests and later alone. "You should have used the other silver. The Hendersons noticed." He made her feel like a beautifully maintained piece of property whose value was slowly depreciating. She knew about the other women, of course. They were a part of the unspoken contract of their marriage. They were always discreet, temporary distractions. Flight attendants, young associates, the wives of his business rivals. Helen learned to ignore them. They were fleeting. She was permanent. She was the mother of his children, the mistress of his home. She was Mrs. Arthur Graham, a title with the weight and security of a bank vault. But Brenda Jensen was different. She arrived at Graham Enterprises 5 years ago, fresh out of business school, with ambition that burned like a wildfire. She was assigned to Arthur's executive floor, and it didn't take long for him to notice her. She was not just beautiful. She was a mirror. She reflected his own hunger, his own ruthlessness. She looked at him not with the placid admiration of a wife, but with the avarice of an apprentice who wanted to learn at the feet of the master. Helen saw the change in Arthur immediately. This wasn't a casual dalliance. He was energized, reckless. He started talking about Brenda testing the waters. Remarkable young woman, that Jensen, sharp as a tack. He promoted her to special assistant, a newly created role with a vague job description and an exorbitant salary. Soon, Brenda was not just in his office. She was in their life. She was on his private jet at his side during business dinners in Paris, and her name began appearing in gossip columns, always next to his. For the first time, Helen felt a tremor of genuine fear. The other women had been footnotes. Brenda was trying to write herself into the main text. She was a threat not just to Helen's marriage, but to the entire empire she had helped build and preserve. The breaking point came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, sickening discovery. Arthur had always handled the family's finances, a domain he guarded jealously. But one afternoon, a statement from their private bank was accidentally delivered to her personal mail. It was for an account she didn't know existed, a discretionary fund. Curious, she opened it. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars were flowing out. There were wire transfers to an offshore account, charges for a jeweler known for its extravagant modern pieces, nothing like the classic jewelry Arthur bought for her, a lease payment for a penthouse on Park Avenue, and monthly payments disguised under a consulting company name that were clearly a salary. A very, very generous one. Helen traced the consulting company online. Its sole director was Brenda Jensen. She sat in her pristine, sun-drenched sitting room, the bank statement in her hand, and felt the gilded floor of her cage fall away. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just about sex or companionship. This was a financial siphoning. He was using company resources, their resources, her children's legacy to build a second parallel life with this woman. Brenda wasn't just a mistress. She was an accomplice in the slow, methodical looting of their own empire. In that moment, something inside Helen shifted. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing slights and ignoring infidelities, came to an end. The hurt was there, a deep, cold ache. But beneath it, something harder began to form resolve. Arthur had made a critical mistake. He had confused her silence for weakness. He had mistaken her grace for ignorance. He had forgotten that while he was the quarterback, she had been watching the whole field for 35 years. She knew every play, every weakness, every secret vulnerability in the empire they had built. She did not confront him. She did not cry or scream. That would have been a waste of energy, and it would have given him the satisfaction of her pain. Instead, she folded the bank statement, placed it in her private safe, and made a phone call. It wasn't to a divorce lawyer. It was to a man named Robert Sterling, the most discreet and ruthless forensic accountant in New York City. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm and even. "I am Helen Graham. I believe there are some irregularities in my husband's company finances. I require a full private audit and absolute discretion." The game had changed. Helen was no longer a pawn. She was a player, and she was prepared to wait as long as it took for checkmate. From Brenda Jensen's perspective, her life was a fairy tale. She had grown up in a working-class town in Ohio, fueled by a desperate ambition to escape mediocrity. She saw her beauty and her sharp mind not as gifts, but as tools, instruments to be used to carve out the life she deserved. In Arthur Graham, she saw her masterpiece. Their affair didn't begin in a sleazy hotel. It began in the boardroom. During a tense negotiation with a German firm, Brenda, then just a junior analyst, noticed a flaw in the translation of a key clause that would have cost Graham Enterprises millions. She scribbled a note and had it passed to Arthur. He glanced at it, his eyes widened slightly, and he adjusted his strategy. He won. That night he invited her for a drink at the St. Regis. He wasn't just an older, powerful man. He was a force of nature. He listened to her ideas, praised her intelligence, and made her feel like the most brilliant woman in the world. He told her she reminded him of himself when he was young, hungry, overlooked, and destined for greatness. "My wife Helen," he said one evening, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She's a good woman, a wonderful mother. But she doesn't understand this world, the fight, the fire. You do, Brenda. You understand." It was the oldest line in the book, but Arthur delivered it with such convincing melancholy that Brenda believed it completely. She saw Helen as a relic, a beautiful but empty piece of antique furniture in Arthur's life. Brenda was the modern dynamic partner he truly needed. Arthur showered her with the spoils of his empire. The penthouse on Park Avenue was a company asset for her use. The platinum card with no limit was for business expenses. The jewelry, the couture clothes, the trips to Monaco, they were all, in his words, investments in the brand. She was part of the Graham Enterprises brand now. She was also smart. She knew she needed more than just trinkets. She needed security. She started as his lover, but she quickly became his confidant. She sat in on his most sensitive meetings, offering sharp insights. She learned the rhythms of his business, the secrets hidden in the balance sheets. And she started to help herself. It began small. Inflated expense reports that Arthur would sign with a wink. Then she set up a consulting firm, just her a laptop and a bank account in the Cayman Islands. She would create invoices for market analysis or strategic consulting, and Arthur would direct his accounts department to pay them without question. "You deserve it," he told her, signing a check for $250,000 for a report she'd spent an hour writing. "You've added millions in value to this company. This is just your commission." Brenda believed him. In her mind, she wasn't stealing. She was taking what was owed to her. She was an essential part of the machine, and this was her compensation. She saw herself and Arthur as a power couple operating on a level above common morality. Helen and the children were the past. She was the future. Her delusion was so complete that she began to pity Helen. She would see her at the occasional company gala, standing by Arthur's side, so quiet and passive. Brenda would give her a polite, condescending smile. Poor woman, she'd think. She has no idea what real passion is. She has no idea who her husband really is. She mistook Helen's silence for defeat. During the last year of Arthur's life, as his illness took hold, Brenda doubled down. She saw this not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. She became his gatekeeper, managing his schedule, screening his calls, and isolating him from anyone she deemed a negative influence, which included increasingly his own family. "David is just after the CEO seat," she'd whisper to Arthur as she adjusted his pillows. "And Jessica only calls when she wants money for her silly art projects. They don't love you, Arthur. Not like I do." She played the part of the devoted caregiver to perfection, spoon-feeding him broth, reading him the Wall Street Journal, and always reminding him of her loyalty. She was certain of her final victory. She had seen the lawyers coming and going from the house. She knew he was updating his will. She had dropped hints, of course. "I don't know what I'll do without you, Arthur." She'd wept her head on his chest. "I'll be all alone. Everything I have is because of you. Don't you worry, my fiery girl." He had rasped, his voice weak. "I've taken care of you. I've made sure you'll be recognized for everything you've done for me." She took that as a sacred promise. Recognized for everything you've done. To her, that meant a fortune. It meant legitimacy. It meant winning. So as she sat in that lawyer's office, listening to the pittance left to the children and the shockingly large portfolio left to the wife, she wasn't worried. She saw it as Arthur's final strategic move, a way of keeping the family quiet, of giving them enough so they wouldn't contest the will. He had to give Helen the house and the company structure. It was for appearances. But the real wealth, the liquid assets, the cash he had carefully moved over the years, that would be for her. It was the only thing that made sense. She had given him the best years of her life. She had been his partner, his confidant, his fire. She had earned her reward. And now Mr. Abernathy was about to announce it to the world. She held her breath, ready for her coronation. While Brenda was building her fantasy, Helen was building a case. Robert Sterling, the forensic accountant, was a ghost. He and his small team operated with the precision of surgeons and the invisibility of spies. For 18 months, they delved into the labyrinth of Arthur Graham's finances. Helen met with Sterling once a month in the private reading room of a discreet, members-only library in Manhattan. She would arrive with a thermos of tea and a notebook looking like any other society wife attending a book club. Sterling, a man with a perpetually unimpressed expression, would present his findings in a plain manila folder. The first report confirmed her suspicions: the discretionary fund, the penthouse, the jewelry. It was all there, a clear pattern of misappropriated funds. But Sterling dug deeper. He peeled back the layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts that Arthur had constructed over decades. "Your husband is a brilliant man, Mrs. Graham," Sterling said during their third meeting, pushing a spreadsheet across the table. "And a very careful one. But everyone leaves a trail." The trail led directly to Brenda Jensen. They uncovered her shell consulting firm, Jensen Strategic Solutions. They found every inflated invoice, every questionable wire transfer. Sterling's team discovered that Brenda hadn't just been taking money Arthur gave her. She had learned his methods. She had started initiating transfers herself, forging Arthur's digital signature on minor transactions, testing the limits. Emboldened when no one noticed, she grew more brazen. She was skimming from accounts Arthur himself had set up for skimming. She was a thief, stealing from a master thief. Sterling calculated the total. Over 5 years, Brenda Jensen had personally diverted or been the direct beneficiary of $14.7 million from Graham Enterprises and its subsidiaries. Helen stared at the number printed in stark black ink at the bottom of the page. $14,700,000. It was a staggering sum, enough to constitute multiple felonies: wire fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. She felt a cold, hard anger settle in her chest. This wasn't a heartbroken wife discovering an affair. This was a business owner discovering a massive internal theft. "What are my options?" Helen asked, her voice steady. "Legally," Sterling replied, adjusting his tie. "You could have her arrested tomorrow. With this evidence, the district attorney would have a field day. It would also, however, implicate your husband and create a public scandal that would decimate the company's stock price. The board would be eviscerated. Your children's inheritance would be caught in a decade of lawsuits and federal investigations." Helen nodded slowly. That was Arthur's shield. He had entangled his crimes so deeply with the company's legitimate success that to expose one would be to destroy the other. He thought it made him untouchable. For months, Helen did nothing with the information. She kept the folder in her safe, a ticking time bomb. She continued to play the part of the dutiful wife. She attended dinners, smiled at parties, and watched as Arthur, increasingly frail from his illness, leaned more and more on Brenda. She watched Brenda preen and posture, ordering the household staff around during her visits, acting as if she were already the lady of the manor. And Helen said nothing. She just watched, and she waited. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. Arthur had been given his final diagnosis by his doctor's: lung cancer, aggressive and inoperable. 6 months at most. That evening he sat in his study, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking out at the manicured lawns of his estate. Helen entered and sat in the armchair opposite him. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. "They told you, I suppose?" "Yes," she said softly. "I imagine you're thrilled." He sneered, a flash of the old, cruel Arthur. Helen didn't take the bait. Instead, she leaned forward and placed a single piece of paper on the table between them. It was the summary page from Robert Sterling's report, showing the single damning number, $14,700,000, next to the name Brenda Jensen. Arthur stared at the paper. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly grey pallor. He looked up at his wife, and for the first time in years he looked at her, not as a possession or a fixture, but as an opponent. The charming mask fell away, and all that was left was a tired, sick old man who had been outmaneuvered. "How long have you known?" he whispered. "Long enough," Helen replied, her voice calm. He was silent for a full minute, his mind, even dulled by illness, racing through the implications. She had him. She had Brenda. She could destroy everything. "What do you want, Helen? A divorce?" "Half of everything. You want to see me ruined in my last days." "No, Arthur," she said, and her voice was so devoid of emotion, it was chilling. "I don't want a scandal. I don't want the company destroyed. David and Jessica deserve to inherit something other than a pile of lawsuits and shame. You built an empire, and I will not see it burn down because of your sordid little affair with a common thief." "So what's your price?" he asked, defeated. "There is no price," she said, standing up. "There is only the solution. You are going to call Mr. Abernathy tomorrow. You are going to draw up a new will. David will get the CEO position. Jessica will be protected. And I," she paused, looking him directly in the eye, "will get the holding company. I will have ultimate control to protect it." He stared at her, stunned into silence by her audacity. "And as for Ms. Jensen," Helen continued, "you will leave her nothing. Not a dime. You will, however, include a special provision for her. A little something to recognize her for all her services. I have an idea for the precise wording. I think you'll find it appropriate." Arthur looked at the woman he had underestimated for 35 years. He saw no tears, no rage, no heartbreak. He saw only cold, calculated strategy. In a strange, twisted way, he felt a flicker of admiration. She had learned his games after all. She had learned them so well. She had finally beaten him. He picked up the phone to call his lawyer. Helen walked out of the study, leaving the summary of Brenda's crimes on the table. The quiet reckoning was complete. All that was left was the public execution. The final 6 weeks of Arthur Graham's life were a masterclass in psychological warfare conducted from a sickbed. After that fateful evening in his study, the dynamic in the Greenwich mansion shifted profoundly. Arthur, weakened by his aggressive cancer treatments, was a king in exile within his own home. He was trapped between two women, one who held his future and one who held his past, and he knew with bitter certainty that he had lost control of both. Helen became the perfect, dutiful nurse. She managed his medication, consulted with his doctors, and ensured he was comfortable. But her care was clinical efficient and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the care one would give to a valuable, albeit terminal business asset. There were no tender words, no hands held in the night. There was only the quiet, unnerving presence of a woman who knew all his secrets and was patiently waiting for him to die. He would sometimes wake from a morphine-induced haze to see her sitting in a chair by his window, not looking at him, but out at the gardens, her expression placid and unreadable. The silence was more terrifying than any argument would have been. Brenda, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of frantic performative devotion, barred from staying at the mansion by Helen's icily polite but non-negotiable decree. "The doctors insist on absolute quiet, Miss Jensen. Family only." She would visit daily. She'd arrive bearing expensive juices, cashmere blankets, and the latest gossip from the city, her voice a little too loud, her cheerfulness a little too forced. She was completely oblivious to the new reality. She didn't notice the profound shift in Arthur's demeanor toward her. His praise became hollow, his promises vague. When she complained about Helen's coldness, he would simply close his eyes and pretend to be asleep. Brenda interpreted his withdrawal as a symptom of his illness, his silence as a sign of his suffering. She had no idea it was the silence of a co-conspirator who had already betrayed her. "She's trying to turn you against me," Brenda would whisper to him, plumping his pillows. "She's jealous. She's always been jealous of what we have, Arthur. Don't let her win." Arthur would just give a weak, non-committal grunt. He was too tired to fight, and more importantly, he was trapped. Helen held the evidence that could not only ruin his legacy, but also send Brenda to prison. The will, as Helen had dictated, was his only way out. It was a final, cruel act of self-preservation. In his dying mind, he rationalized it. Brenda had become greedy, careless. She had embezzled from him his own company. He had been a fool to trust her. In a twisted way, he began to see the will not as Helen's victory, but as his own final act of revenge against the woman who had made him vulnerable. He would be the one to lower the boom, even from beyond the grave. The children were caught in the crossfire. Jessica, ever the daddy's girl, was torn. She saw her mother's cold efficiency and Brenda's tearful devotion, and her sympathies naturally leaned toward the latter. She accused Helen of being heartless. "Dad is dying, Mum, and you're acting like he's just a business deal to be concluded," she cried one evening in the kitchen. "Your father made many business deals in his life." "Jessica," Helen replied calmly, stirring a pot of soup, "this is just the last one. You'll understand one day." David, however, saw things more clearly. He had worked under his father for a decade and had long suspected financial irregularities. He had noticed Brenda's meteoric rise and the blank checks she seemed to wield. Seeing his mother's newfound steeliness, he didn't question it. He simply aligned himself with her. He saw a power shift and knew which side to be on. He began spending more time at the house, acting as a quiet guard, running interference against Brenda's increasingly desperate attempts to get private time with Arthur. The final meeting between Arthur and Brenda was 2 days before he died. He was lucid, but his voice was a mere whisper. Brenda managed to get David out of the room for a few minutes and seized her chance. "Arthur, my love," she said, clutching his frail hand, "we need to talk about the lawyers, about what happens after. You promised you would protect me." Arthur looked at her, his eyes sunken, but strangely sharp. He saw the avarice beneath her feigned concern. He saw the woman who had started by admiring his power and ended by trying to steal it. "You'll get exactly what you deserve, Brenda," he whispered, a faint, cryptic smile on his lips. "It's all taken care of. You will be fully recognized." A wave of relief, so profound it made her dizzy, washed over Brenda. He had done it. He still loved her. "Oh, Arthur, thank you," she sobbed, burying her face in his hand. "I love you so much." He closed his eyes and didn't speak again. Those were the last words he ever said to her, a promise that was in fact the most terrible threat he could conceive. He died 48 hours later, with Helen sitting quietly by his side, holding a book she wasn't reading. Brenda made a scene at the funeral, weeping louder than the children demanding to be seated in the front row as family. Helen, in an act of what everyone assumed was magnanimity, but was actually strategic calculation, allowed it. She wanted Brenda front and center. She wanted everyone to see her when the final act played out. She let Brenda have her moment of false glory, knowing that her moment of true public humiliation was just around the corner. Back in the suffocating silence of Mr. Abernathy's office, the moment had arrived. The preamble was over. The estate, the company, the art, all the trappings of Arthur Graham's life had been distributed. Only one piece of business remained. And finally, the lawyer repeated his voice, seeming to echo in the small space. To Miss Brenda Jensen. Brenda's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her dress, a gesture of supreme confidence, and glanced at Helen. The old woman was still watching her, her face a placid, unreadable mask. Enjoy your hollow victory, Brenda thought. You have the company, but I had his heart, and his cash. Mr. Abernathy looked down at the last page of the will. He paused as if to steel himself, and then he read the words Arthur Graham had penned as his final venomous legacy. To Miss Brenda Jensen, in recognition of her unique and tireless services to me and my company over the past 5 years, I make the following one-time, non-negotiable bequest. Brenda leaned in a triumphant smile, finally breaking through her tear-stained facade. Here it was. Unique and tireless services. The recognition she craved. The lawyer continued, his voice as flat and final as a judge's gavel. I bequeath to her full and complete title to the sum total of all funds, assets, and monetary instruments she successfully managed to embezzle from Graham Enterprises, its subsidiaries, and my personal accounts during her term of employment. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Brenda's smile froze, cracking at the edges. Her mind struggled to process the words. Embezzle. What was he talking about? It was a gift, a commission. David, who had been stoic until now, let out a short, sharp breath of disbelief. Jessica's head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes, wide with confusion, looking from the lawyer to Brenda. But Abernathy wasn't finished. The sentence wasn't over. It had a second, far more lethal part. This bequest is made with the full and complete forgiveness of the company, for said acts conditional and effective only upon her signature of a legally binding confession to be provided by my executor, detailing all such activities, thereby indemnifying the estate from any future claims or legal challenges from her forever. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on them all. Brenda stared at the lawyer, her mouth slightly agape. Her brain, usually so quick and sharp, was short-circuiting. She replayed the sentence in her head, trying to find a loophole, a misunderstanding. Bequeath. The sum total of all funds she embezzled. So he was giving her the money conditional upon her signature of a legally binding confession. A confession to a felony. Multiple felonies. A piece of paper that would be a one-way ticket to a federal prison. The trap was brilliant. It was diabolical. Arthur wasn't giving her a gift. He was giving her a choice, but it was the choice between two hangman's nooses. Option A, refuse to sign. Walk away with nothing but the clothes on her back. And in doing so, she would tacitly admit guilt, leaving herself wide open to criminal prosecution from the company, a company now controlled by the woman sitting calmly across the table. Helen would have the full weight of Graham Enterprises' legal team and a mountain of forensic evidence to bury her with. Option B, sign the confession. By signing, she would legally accept the bequest. The stolen money would officially become hers. She would get to keep the $14.7 million, but she would also have handed her enemies a signed admission of guilt for grand larceny, wire fraud, and a host of other charges. They might choose not to prosecute immediately, but they would hold that confession over her head for the rest of her life. She would be forever at their mercy, a puppet whose strings were held by Helen Graham. Any wrong move, any attempt to talk to the press, any future trouble, and they could simply hand the confession to the district attorney. It was a checkmate from beyond the grave. He had recognized her for all her services by quantifying them as a criminal act. He had taken care of her by ensuring her utter and complete destruction. Brenda's face went through a rapid, horrifying transformation. The confident smirk melted away, replaced by stunned confusion, then dawning comprehension, then stark animal panic. She looked at Helen, whose expression had not changed one iota. But now Brenda understood her calmness. It wasn't the serenity of a grieving widow. It was the absolute tranquility of a victor who had known the outcome of the battle before it even began. The pressure in Brenda's chest built until it was unbearable. The room began to spin. The faces of the children, the dry, pitiless face of the lawyer, the serene, terrifying face of the wife, they all blurred into a nightmarish collage. The fantasy life she had so carefully constructed, the wealth, the status, the victory had been a lie. A long, elaborate setup for her own execution. She wasn't Arthur's queen. She was his final, cruel joke. The sound that ripped from her throat was not a cry of grief. It was a raw, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated horror. It was the sound of a soul being publicly and irrevocably dismantled. Brenda Jensen's scream echoed off the mahogany walls and then died, leaving a ringing, horrifying silence in its wake. She was hyperventilating, her carefully constructed facade shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head violently. "No, it's a lie. It's a trick. He loved me. Helen, you did this. You poisoned him against me." Helen didn't even dignify the accusation with a response. She simply looked at Mr. Abernathy. The lawyer, unflappable as ever, slid a thin, 2-page document across the table toward Brenda. "This is the confession, Ms. Jensen," he said, his voice neutral. "It contains a full accounting of the funds, as prepared by a third-party audit. You have 30 days to sign it in the presence of your own legal counsel. If you sign, the funds in the specified offshore account will be transferred to you. If you do not, the offer is rescinded, and the company," he paused, glancing at Helen, "reserves the right to pursue all available legal remedies to recover its stolen assets." Stolen assets. The words hung in the air, clinical and damning. Brenda stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. She pushed it away, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm not signing anything. This is insane. I'll sue. I'll tell everyone what he promised me." David spoke for the first time, his voice low and cold. "You'll tell them that my father financed your lifestyle with money you embezzled from his company. By all means, Brenda. Go to the press. I'm sure the U.S. Attorney's Office reads the morning papers." Reality crashed down on Brenda with the force of a physical blow. There was no escape, no angle to play. Every door was closed and locked. She looked from David's hard face to Jessica's, which was now a mask of shocked disillusionment as she finally began to understand the true nature of the man she had idolized. Finally, Brenda's eyes landed back on Helen. "Why?" Brenda whispered, her voice cracking. "I never did anything to you." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Helen's face. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was a profound, weary pity. "You misunderstood your position, Ms. Jensen," Helen said, her voice soft but clear. "You thought you were a partner in his life. You were just a liability on his balance sheet. Arthur never tolerated liabilities for long, and neither do I." With that, Helen stood up. She placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder. "Come, children, let's go home." David stood immediately and helped his sister to her feet. The three of them walked out of the office, not looking back, leaving Brenda Jensen alone with Mr. Abernathy and the 2 pieces of paper that represented the ruin of her life. The aftermath was quiet and swift. Brenda hired a lawyer, a flashy litigator who made threats and blustered for a week. But after Mr. Abernathy allowed him to review a small, heavily redacted sample of Robert Sterling's evidence, the blustering stopped. The choice was clear: a life as a wealthy pariah under Helen Graham's thumb, or a near certain 10 years in a federal prison. 2 weeks later, a humbled, broken Brenda Jensen signed the confession. The money was transferred. She disappeared overnight. The penthouse was sold, her name vanished from the society pages, and she became a ghost, haunted by the fortune she could never truly enjoy. Helen Graham, meanwhile, stepped into her new role with an ease that stunned the business world. The quiet, unassuming wife was gone. In her place was a shrewd, decisive matriarch. She didn't take the CEO title. She promoted David as planned. But she ran the G Holding Corporation's board with an iron will. She trimmed the fat sold-off Arthur's vain passion projects and reinvested in the company's core strengths. She proved to be more strategically brilliant than Arthur had been in his last decade. Graham Enterprises' stock soared. She reconnected with her children on a new, more honest level. She finally explained the full story to Jessica, who, after a period of grieving for the father she thought she knew, came to understand and deeply respect the mother she had so long underestimated. The family, once fractured by Arthur's betrayals, was forged anew in the truth stronger than ever before. Sometimes Helen would sit in Arthur's old study, the one where her quiet reckoning had begun. She would look out over the vast estate, the empire she now commanded. She had not sought this power, but she would wield it to protect the legacy her children deserved. She had stood quietly by her husband for 35 years, a silent partner in his triumphs and his deceptions. But in the end, it was her silence, her patience, and her unyielding resolve that had had the final word. She had not screamed or cried. She had simply waited, and she had won. The story of Helen Graham is a powerful reminder that the loudest person in the room is not always the most powerful. It's a tale of deep betrayal, quiet strength, and perfectly executed revenge. We see how a lifetime of being underestimated can forge a will of steel, and how the truth, when finally revealed, can be more devastating than any weapon. What Arthur and Brenda saw as weakness was Helen's greatest strength, her patience. She played the long game, and in the end, she didn't just win. She rewrote the rules and took control of the entire board. If this story of calculated justice and hidden strength resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates a story where the quietest character has the last laugh. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas and incredible stories of human complexity. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.